Stephen, you have to unmute.
Yep.
Thank you, Stephen.
Pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
You can. Okay. It's good to be with you, and I'm looking forward to dialoguing afterwards with our other guest speakers. What is Christian Zionism? Well, I'm going to reiterate what Jonathan and Don has said. This is I've done two works on this subject: Christian Zionism Roadmap to Armageddon and Zionist Christian Soldiers, and in them I unpack the historical roots, the theological basis, and political consequences of Christian Zionism, and you can access them from my website. A lot more material there, but to summarize what Christian Zionism is, Don referred to the website christianzionism.org. On there we have this definition. Christian Zionists believe that modern Israel is a continuation of biblical Israel and therefore should enjoy special privileges. They declare that it's the responsibility of Christians to support the state of Israel and its policies. To give you an insight as to how this is perceived by Israeli leaders, Benjamin Netanyahu said recently, "I don't believe the Jewish state and modern Zionism would have been possible without Christian Zionism. We value our friends and we never forget them." Well, what does he mean? He means basically that Christian Zionism outnumbers Jewish Zionism 10 to 1 and preceded Jewish Zionism by at least 50 years. The Pew Forum for Religion showed that 25% of American Christians believe it's their responsibility to support the nation of Israel. But when you're looking at white evangelicals, that's 63%. And here we begin to see the hint that this is a white supremacist movement. John Hagee, founder of Christians United for Israel, said, "The sleeping giant of Christian Zionism is awake, and there are 50 million Christians standing up and applauding Israel. Think of our future together. 50 million evangelicals joining in common cause with 5 million Jewish people in America on behalf of Israel is a match made in heaven." See, we're dealing with 10 to 1. This is a dominant movement. So when you think Zionism, think Christian Zionism before Jewish Zionism. Historical roots, as Don intimated, we're going back to the beginning of the 19th century. Napoleon was the first world ruler in thousands of years to promise the Jews a homeland. He thought that a compliant Jewish presence in Palestine would help defeat the British. And so he offered Palestine to the Jews. He failed to deliver, but Britain took on that same role, recognizing that to defeat the French and then subsequently the Germans, we needed a presence in Palestine, and that's why Britain sponsored a Jewish presence there. The political pragmatists were joined by, as Don has mentioned, religious fundamentalists. Christian leaders began to speculate in the early 1820s. They were known as the Albury Circle, named after the home of Henry Drummond, the High Sheriff of Surrey, a banker, wealthy banker. He began to invite Christian leaders and political leaders to his home in Advent every year to speculate about the geopolitical interests of Britain and how they perceived the Bible coming true in what they deemed as the end times. And out of that movement, the theology of Edward Irving, John Darby, and Cyrus Scofield in particular developed the idea that God had a separate plan for the Jews apart from the church. I'm not going to look at the theology. Jonathan has hinted about that somewhat already, has elaborated on that. And if you want to follow the theology, you can look at my website. But just a couple of quotes to give you an insight into the way in which Christian leaders undergirded the fledgling Zionist movement. Shaftesbury in 1840 was taking paid adverts in the London Times, calling upon European leaders to support the return of the Jewish people to Palestine. He saw this as a theological conviction, but also pragmatically, he had a political agenda too. And as Don mentioned, the phrase "a land of no people for a people with no land" was actually coined 50 years earlier by Lord Shaftesbury, "a country without a nation for a nation without a country." And Herzl's book, The Jewish State, was actually preceded 2 years earlier by one by William Heschler, who was the Anglican chaplain to Vienna, to the English embassy in Vienna. In fact, if you go to Herzl's diary, you find him acknowledging the support and initiative given by William Heschler. He describes him as a prophet, enthusiastic for my solution of the Jewish question. But notice what he says. He says, we Christians have prepared the ground for you, Heschler said triumphantly. I take him as a naive visionary, gives me excellent advice, unmistakable, genuine goodwill. He is at once clever and mystical, cunning and naive. Everything you need in a good Christian clergyman. And when the Balfour Declaration was published in October 1917, it's not widely known that Balfour invited the Jewish organization, the Zionist organization, to write the first draft. And it went through several drafts between July 1917 and October 1917. And the reason Balfour published his declaration was, remember, this is in the middle of the First World War, it was to preempt a German declaration promising the Jews a homeland, because Britain and Germany were both seeking to control the Middle East for the land routes to Africa and India. Edward Montagu was one of the members of the British cabinet. He was a Jewish member of the cabinet. He was much more skeptical about Balfour's motivation. He said, Zionism is a mischievous political creed. And he was worried that the publishing of the Balfour Declaration and Britain's undergirding of the Zionist movement would result in anti-Semitism and prove a rallying ground for anti-Semites in every country in the world. Certainly there were anti-Semitic elements within the British leadership, intelligentsia, the political establishment, who wanted to encourage Jews to go and live in Palestine. In fact, Balfour himself admitted in a letter to Lord Curzon, written a couple of years later, in Palestine, we don't even propose to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. We are committed to Zionism, and whether it's right or wrong, good or bad, it's rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes of far profounder import than the desires or prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. It was because Britain was committed to controlling Palestine. We weren't offering the Jewish people a state. We were offering them a home in the British Empire. And in that letter, he admits that they've made no statement of fact, which is not admittedly wrong, and no declaration of policy, which at least in the letter, they haven't always intended to violate. So they promised in the declaration a home for the Jewish people. They promised to protect the rights of the Arab majority, but they promised it to the French that they were going to keep the Middle East between the British and the French empires. The French were going to get Syria and what is today Lebanon and parts of Turkey, and Britain was going to control much of the Middle East from the Mediterranean right across to Arabia to the Gulf states. And so Jerusalem and Palestine was central to controlling the Middle East on behalf of the British Empire. And the partition plan of 1947 that led to the establishment of the State of Israel was a very pragmatic, you could almost say a cynical attempt for Britain to exit Palestine when it realized it was not going to achieve its objectives. You see the three parts that were given over to the Arabs, the three parts given to the Jews. When neither of them were contiguous. So both sides had to fight in order to achieve what they wanted. If we just take a step back, all of what I've just been sharing with you came out of the American slavery movement and segregation. It was parked right in the middle, from the middle of the 19th century right through to the present day. And so as the slave trade gave way to segregation in the United States, it led to the Aryanism within Germany. It actually inspired it, and apartheid in South Africa. And if you find that hard to believe, listen to one of the most significant theologians Britain has ever produced. John Stott said, anti-Semitism in Germany, apartheid in South Africa seem at first sight so different from one another. Nevertheless, the theory of race on which both systems were built is almost identical. So is the sense which many Germans and South Africans have expressed that they are, quote, destined to rule and must at all costs preserve their racial purity. So the apartheid in South Africa has formed the model for what has happened in Israel. We call it Hafrada. That's the Hebrew word. Back in 1987, Uri Davis was tabulating and recording evidence of Israel as an apartheid state. Jimmy Carter, 2007, Peace Not Apartheid. Reinforced, as we know this year, by the B'Tselem report and the Human Rights Watch report, exposing the apartheid nature of Israel's policies, both within Israel and also in the occupied territories. Visualizing Palestine, I've got some brilliant graphics to reinforce this. You know, the word Hafrada is the word used to describe the wall. It simply means separation. It's the same word as apartheid in Dutch Afrikaner. These major reports published this year have exposed the 3 ways in which Israel is perpetrating the crime of apartheid. The intent to dominate, the systematic oppression, and the intent to integrate Jews and segregate Palestinians. So Hafrada, as we see it in Israel today, is segregation by ethnicity. It's leading to the subjugation of the Palestinians and the sequestration of Palestine. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it is being undergirded, funded, and defended by Christian Zionism. Jeff Halper's Matrix of Control helps us to see how apartheid has been institutionally structured through law, through planning, through zoning, and so on, in order to subjugate the Palestinians and sequestrate their land. So what is Christian Zionism? It's a deviant religious movement justifying racism, segregation, and apartheid. How is it impacting the Palestinians? Well, as Donna said, they have a political agenda, and I'm going to shoot through this very quickly. They are lobbying the White House and Congress on a daily basis on behalf of Israel. These are some of the Christian organizations that are the foundation of Christian Zionists today. Christian Friends of Israel, International Christian Embassy, Bridges for Peace, Jerusalem Prayer Team, Christians United for Israel. Secondly, they are funding the emigration of Jews, particularly into the occupied territories. International Christian Embassy has been funding the Jewish people from Russia and Eastern Europe particularly, and also from Ethiopia, to make Aliyah and make their home in Palestine. Thirdly, supporting the illegal settlements. You'll find organizations such as Christian Friends of Israeli Communities twinning churches with settlements, with the funding of settlement projects and the money coming from churches. And they were very much behind the pressure put on the US administration in order to recognize the annexation of the settlements. Moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem, you might think, what on earth has that got to do with what's happening in Palestine? But when the US Embassy was moved to Jerusalem, it was in a sense saying Jerusalem is the exclusive, undivided capital of Israel, and everyone else has to follow suit eventually. The International Christian Embassy was founded in 1980, and as you know, Trump made it one of his campaign pledges to move the US Embassy to Jerusalem. But for 40 years before that event, it was being pushed by Christian political leaders and religious leaders in the States. In fact, Trump made quite an honest statement I think it was on CNN. He said, "We moved the capital to Israel, to Jerusalem." Notice what he's saying. We moved the capital. No, they moved the embassy. But he's saying we moved the capital. That's for the evangelicals. You know, it's amazing that the evangelicals are more excited than the Jews. You see where the power lies. And then accusing critics of anti-Semitism. Anyone who questions the Christian Zionist agenda is accused automatically of being anti-Semitic. A strong coalition emerging between Zionist organizations and Christian Zionists to further this. We've seen this particularly in the UK. And I was the subject of an article in Premier Christian News in August. Thankfully, we forced them to retract it, to apologize and to pay my legal fees. But it's just one example of how they try and demonize those who criticize what they're doing. Supporting the Temple movement, they're seeking to rebuild the Jewish temple on the Temple Mount, destroy the Dome of the Rock. Gershon Salomon, one of the leaders, said we must have a war. The Messiah will not come by himself. We should bring him by fighting. There are numerous books written by Christian leaders about the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. And ultimately, they are fueling the conflict. You'll find people like Franklin Graham making atrocious statements about the Arabs and Palestinians. Hagee urging the US administration to attack Iran preemptively. And these are the kinds of books that keep many Christian bookstores with their doors open. An apocalyptic agenda of the future. That's their agenda, their political agenda, rooted in their heretical theological views. How can we combat it? Well, the theme and that's the foundation of my presentation is to emphasize that we must equate Christian Zionism with the defense of apartheid. It's hard to find anyone today who defends apartheid in South Africa. We just have to remember 20 or 30 years ago, 30 or 40 years ago, it was the other way around. We were in a minority arguing for BDS against Barclays Bank and others who were funding the South African regime. But the whole axis shifted quite dramatically in a short period of time, and we must work to achieve the same with Christian Zionism. The church leaders in Jerusalem in around 2004 issued a statement repudiating Christian Zionism as a false doctrine. They rejected the alliance between Christian Zionist leaders and the government of Israel, its domination over Palestine. They called upon Christians around the world to liberate themselves from the ideologies of militarism and occupation. And it was signed by the heads of the churches. And Don Wagner and I had a small part in helping to draft the original declaration. But in a more contemporary way, Kairos and Sabeel are two organizations that I would commend to you to explore and to work with, who are campaigning to challenge Christian Zionism. We had a conference recently in the UK, Sabeel Kairos, and at the conference, we passed probably the first statement from a Christian organization equating Zionism with apartheid and calling upon Christians in particular to repudiate it. We said this: having considered a Christian response to Israeli apartheid, we affirm that all people are created equally in the image of God. We commend the B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch documents designating Israel as an apartheid state. We repudiate all forms of racism and discrimination, and we recommit ourselves to working for justice, peace, and reconciliation in Israel-Palestine. One final quote. Desmond Tutu said this recently. He said, "The end of apartheid stands as one of the crowning accomplishments of the last century, but we would not have succeeded without the help of international pressure. If apartheid ended, so can the occupation, but the moral force and the international pressure will have to be just as determined. The current divestment effort is the first, but certainly not the only necessary move in that direction." That's the challenge that we face today. Thank you for allowing me to mess with your minds. My books are published by Whitford Stock in the States. And as I said, you can access a lot of it from my website. And if you're curious about what I do in my spare time, I lead a small charity called Peacemakers .ngo. Thank you very much for allowing me to give this presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you. We're going to be moving into a Q&A section now. We'll have about 10-15 minutes at the